Okay.
Okay.
Ah. Da-da. And then it has a delay, I think. So I usually talk when I'm not supposed to.
All right. Time for technology to catch up.
Absolutely. Okay, I just wanted to welcome you to our Let's Talk Career series. Just to let you know, the purpose of this series is to help people who are thinking about changing their careers or enter into a new career by learning firsthand about specific occupations. Today, our guest is Shayna Beeksma. I just wanted to thank you, Shayna, for agreeing to be a part of our interview series. Thank you for joining us. And I guess we'll just start by asking you to tell yourself.
So about myself. So as you just mentioned, my name is Shayna Beeksma. I'm a lawyer here in Hamilton. I have my own firm, Beeksma Law Professional Corporation, and I specialize in 3 areas of law: estates, real estate, and business law. Both the transactional or solicitor side as well as the litigation side. And we'll get into what those terms mean in a moment. And actually, I can even mention it right now. So in Ontario, lawyers wear 2 hats, or they're solicitors or they're barristers, or should I say, and they are barristers. Contrast that with areas like England, where you're one or the other. So you can only practice in one of those sides of the coin, if you want to think of it that way. In Ontario, people are both, but then they can choose what they want to do. So that's kind of nice. And so I do both sides. Solicitor would be anything that's transactional or planning, anything that's outside of the court. Litigation is anything in the court. So that's what I do. I focus on court work as well as non-court work in those 3 areas.
Okay, so I did a little bit of research on an occupation as a lawyer, and it's not really one size fits all occupation. There's many different types of lawyers. So I had to research and see how many. I'm seeing over 60 different types of lawyers. I'm sure there's more. Can you tell me how that, like how you got into where you are in the field, how you selected the certain type of lawyer you became?
I laugh because that's always a little bit of a journey. And it's actually interesting when you ask that of someone. So I've been practicing now for 8 years. So when I look back, and I've joked with some of my law school friends about this, if we were to look back at our applications to law school, and part of the application involved what was called a personal statement, which basically is your pitch to the selection committee as to why they should admit you to the school. And in that essay, essentially, you're saying what you want to do with your law degree. So many of us, myself included, started off going to law school wanting to do, you could say the rock star fields of law, such as, international criminal law, international human rights law, the ones that really are feel good, big impact, self-sacrifice, and especially I think when you're 20, 21, which is the average age that most folks are applying to law school, you tend to have very, I could say, some naivete and rose-colored glasses on and think that you can just go on out and help the world and make your difference. And you never want to squash that desire in someone. But then reality starts to set in. And so for so many of us, we say, that's what our law school application said. We wanted to be the change makers and do international human rights and criminal law and international criminal law, which was me. And then law school tuition prices hit you, along with student loans. And so an air of practicality and an air of reality about your decisions. And then also the doors that were opened. So in law school, I went to Osgoode Hall. So that's in Toronto and at York University. And at the time, and I hear that that hasn't really changed, the bulk of the pressure on first-year law students in particular was to apply to the big Bay Street firms in Toronto, which are the largest firms and most prestigious firms in Canada. So like many folks, even though I wanted to do international human rights law or international criminal law, I applied because you basically were led to believe that you'd be stupid, essentially, if you didn't put forward an application. Like, why would you close the door on yourself? Get interview experience, get application experience, and see where it lands. And I was fortunate because that was in the time of the recession, 2008, 2009, to have not one, but two job offers from top tier law firms. So then you're thinking, oh, what do I do? I'd be foolish to not accept one of them and get that experience and then figure out that human rights stuff later on, right?
Yeah.
And so when I accepted one of those positions, which was a position at Gowlings, now known as Gowling, WLG, it was to do commercial litigation, which is essentially business law, litigation or court work. Far cry from international human rights or international criminal law, just helping businesses, big businesses like Fortune 500 corporations, sue each other, sue their shareholders, sue their directors and officers. And so that's how I landed in that area, being, A, litigation, but B, business law litigation, essentially. And then my next job after that was, again, I was hired to do commercial litigation. Then I got introduced at that firm which is a different firm, to estate law. So estate litigation, which involves anything from, beneficiaries challenging people who have powers of attorney over someone, to beneficiaries challenging estate trustees or executors, all of those estate battles or power of attorney battles, and also getting into the transactional side or the solicitor side of those fields. So I started getting into real estate as well as so transactions, purchasing and selling properties, and estate planning, which is doing people's wills and powers of attorney, estate administration, so helping folks navigate after a loved one has passed, how to what we call administer an estate. So, and of course, doing business law work in terms of incorporations and purchases and sales of businesses and all of that. So that is how I went from wanting to do international human rights law, so the rock stars, I dubbed them the rock star fields, to doors open. You realize the student debt that you have. Yeah. And you're looking at, potentially a six-figure salary starting off as a new lawyer. And all the common sense bells in your mind are saying, you take it, you run with it, you get your experience, you get the so-called pedigree of having worked at a top tier firm. And then from there, the doors that keep opening are taking you, still in that direction of very different areas of law. Now, there are some classmates of mine, and I tip my hat to them, who didn't cave into the pressure to apply to those Bay Street firms, stayed their course and, went for, say, the one articling position, and articling is required to be called to the bar in Ontario, which means that you're basically kind of like an apprenticeship. It's supposed to be paid as of this year. The law studies mandating that it be paid. So 10 months working under a lawyer, Amnesty International, so again, rockstar organization, only had one articling position across Canada in my graduating year. So that also gives you a sense of those who really stuck it out to do that kind of work. They were looking at few positions being available for them to be even qualified to be called to the bar, and not much work that was paid. Especially, I knew some folks who went over to The Hague in the Netherlands and were doing unpaid internships just to try and get into that. But again, most of us don't have the luxury, if you don't come from a background of means. My parents were immigrants from Jamaica, to do an unpaid internship when you had to pay $20,000 a year in tuition, which is now a savings compared to where Osgoode Hall is at. I hear it's at 30,000 plus per year, tuition alone. So when you're looking at that and the fact that your student loans will come knocking, so an unpaid internship is out of the question. And many folks like myself, I would say the bulk of my law school classmates and I, had to be very practical about our decisions, in terms of what fields we went into. But for those that stuck it out and were able to do so, like I said, I tipped my hat. And some went into legal aid, So we're still able to do that. But as you mentioned, there are so many areas of law that one can practice. And the reason is the law is around us. It really is this invisible cobweb that people, if I may use that metaphor, that people operate in, and they don't even realize it. So when you think about the fact that you found 60 different areas of law that people could practice, think about all the different categories of life that happen, not just for, say, you and me, who are, your average, middle class persons in a North American society, but look at areas of law that may not affect us personally, but because we aren't in that world, right? And there are lawyers who do those areas of law as well. So anything that one could conceivably think of that would affect an entity, like a company, affect a government, affects. I know someone who was articling at Canadian Blood Services. There are policy lawyers. I mean, almost anything you can think of, there's an area of law. And then the question for folks who want to get into those areas of law is there demand? Will I actually be able to make a living doing this? Or if there's not much of a demand, then thinking, is this something that I can carve out some unique niche to make a demand, right? Be creative, or go with the mainstream, like areas that I went into where there's always a demand for business lawyers, real estate lawyers, and estate lawyers. So that's my long-winded answer, but hopefully that sheds some light on, you could say, the meandering path that you could say throughout had an air of reality and practicality about it. But I actually found myself now in 3 areas of law that I really enjoy. So I feel very lucky, very fortunate.
That's great. Thank you. Would you say there's your favorite part of the job, like something you really enjoy more than something else?
The part of my work that I enjoy the most is helping people. It sounds so cliche, but it really is so true. And when you think about a reason to get up in the morning, I mean, I'm a mom of 2 young boys. They're 3.5 and 10 months respectively. So of course, in that cliche way, I mean, my family is my reason to get up in the morning. But beyond that, there are so many folks who either don't like what they do for a living or hate it. I can tell you that in my experience on Bay Street, as well as in my experience at a mid-sized firm here in Hamilton, prior to opening my own firm 2.5 years ago, I have encountered so many lawyers who really are fundamentally unhappy, maybe depressed, and there actually is a surprisingly high rate of addictions among many lawyers. It can be a very grueling job depending on where you work, who your clients are. I mean, there are a lot of contextual factors there, but it isn't a 9 to 5 unless you work in certain parts of the government. Or certain in-house companies may offer you a 9 to 5, but that's been shifting in recent years, and those are harder to find. So you have to find something else. If work-life balance isn't going to be the thing that generates happiness for you, then what is? And you have to look at the substance of your work. And so that's why, for me, the ability to help people, ability to guide them through processes, procedures, stages of life that they don't have the existing knowledge for because they're a layperson at it. I mean, I'm a layperson in anything that's outside of my areas of practice. Having an advocate when they need it. So with court or with the other side, it's something I often take for granted because it's what I do day in and day out. But when I see the impact on my clients, that I was able to be a voice for them when they didn't have one. I was able to answer some questions that just, fundamentally made life easier because they knew what to do. They knew the steps to take rather than spinning their wheels and getting frustrated and feeling lost or overwhelmed. So that's the best part of my job, is the satisfaction that I can help in many ways.
I can relate to the other side of that. So
Yeah.
anything to help.
Yes. No,
Well, very much
I'm always happy
appreciated.
to do that. You're welcome.
Not to have to go into law school to figure out what you need to do legally. It makes
Yeah,
sense.
for sure.
Has COVID affected your work, the work that you're doing right now, or have you been able to work around? It's so difficult. It's a difficult,
Yeah.
I guess, and a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, it's definitely affected my work, but it's
Mhm,
affected in positive and negative ways.
mhm,
But I would say overwhelmingly positive. So for that, I'm grateful because that is a privilege. COVID has been uh, horrible to so many folks
mhm,
because of their areas of work, their families, their own health. I mean, there's so many folks who have, who are living with lingering, effects of COVID that are affecting their quality of life.
mhm,
Work wise, for me, in terms of the litigation part of my practice, it was effectively shut down once COVID caused court closures back in the middle of March.
mhm,
The courts didn't really start to significantly reopen until about June. I mean, we put through a couple of things between like back in April and May that were urgent because the courts had a high threshold for hearing anything at that time that had to be
mhm.
demonstrably urgent. So we had a couple of things that met that criteria, but otherwise the litigation part of the practice just screeched to a grinding halt
Mm,
and only started picking up again over the summer as the courts started to expand their bandwidth for hearing matters that weren't urgent.
mm,
The other thing that's now that so that's the negative. So of course, when work grinds to a halt, then especially when you're still a business owner, income grinds to a halt
mhm.
in those
Yeah,
areas, and you still
yeah.
have bills to pay. You still have staff whose salaries have to be paid. You
Mhm.
still have to keep your own mortgage in a good standing.
Yeah.
So there's a juggling act there, but I am thankful that the Canadian government did offer resources for many small businesses like myself. So
Mhm.
we have been fortunate and have been able to weather the storm so far, particularly without laying off anybody. So that's been wonderful. Not
That's,
everybody has been in that fortunate position. So
yeah,
very grateful.
unfortunately, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then in terms of positives, like I said at the outset, the positives for me really have outweighed the negatives. And again, I'm so fortunate that I can say that. I'm grateful that I can say that. And that comes in the form of, for me, being more techie oriented, the
Okay.
fact that we have now, of course, it took a pandemic, dragged the courts and the attorney general uh, effectively kicking and screaming into the 21st century
Mhm. Yeah.
by forcing video conferencing like Zoom
Yeah.
for court hearings, for mediations, for swearing documents,
Mhm.
for will signings and power of attorney signings. I mean, these are things that so many lawyers have been pushing for years,
Mhm.
filing court documents electronically.
Yeah.
But there was always pushback that, oh, it's not in the budget or it's not a priority right now, etc. And then a pandemic
Mhm.
forced change.
Yeah.
And suddenly, all those court clerks, with all due respect to them, who said, "Oh, you can't email, court documents to us, pleadings, etc., because there are security issues." Well, guess what? Suddenly, we were emailing court
Yeah.
documents
Yeah.
in
Exactly.
April and May, and the world hasn't completely burnt down as a
No.
result.
No. We managed a way to work through this. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, the another kind of chain, or should I say consequence of that, or result further down the chain that's resulted from that is that um, those of us who already had mostly remote practices, like
Mhm.
myself, were
Mhm.
able to extend you could say, virtual nature of our practice.
Mhm.
And that's been wonderful, especially as a young mom.
Yeah.
And so that I can be doing a lot of work from, a home office or otherwise our regular office, but not have to travel to
Mhm.
Kitchener Court, London Court, St. Catharines
Yeah.
Court, Toronto Court for
Mhm.
matters. That's for the litigation part of my practice. And I can do everything from home. Simcoe, I had a matter recently in Simcoe, and I
Mhm.
can just be here on Zoom And
That's
it's as
amazing.
if the judges that I've been having preside over these matters have been enjoying the convenience too.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the solicitor side, it's been so nice to be doing real estate transactions completely remotely, because even the banks, speaking of the courts, kicking and screaming,
Mm-hmm.
as they're being dragged technologically into our century, the banks as well.
Yeah.
It took a pandemic for them to finally realize that they could permit lawyers to review documents with their clients via
Mm-hmm.
video conference,
Yeah.
accept, I should say, electronic signatures on
Mm-hmm.
these documents, so we can use DocuSign and things like that that are
Mm-hmm.
secure. And so we're able to keep everybody's risk down by not meeting in person
Mm-hmm.
and still get transactions going, because people are still buying and selling houses.
Oh, exactly.
For
It's still
example,
going really well.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's still a necessity. People are still refinancing. So those who are
Mm-hmm.
fortunate to own property and that has equity, and maybe they've lost their jobs, if they were able to apply and successfully for refinancing to help them weather the storm, then
Mm-hmm.
we're able to do that virtually as well.
Yeah.
I think there's so many positives that have come from that, but it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic for the
Yes.
institutions to think more practically
Mm-hmm.
and broadly about the ways in which we can still get these transactions done, we can still offer these services, and to allow us to do that. So that's just been so freeing. And uh, yeah, so I would say that's how COVID has really affected our practice. It's really given us more bandwidth, if I can sum it up, to have an almost completely virtual remote practice,
Mm-hmm.
which is great from a
Oh, it's
millennial point
amazing.
of view, an older millennial point of view.
Yep.
So yeah. And clients love it. It's convenient.
Oh, for sure.
Parking and find parking downtown, to come to
Yeah,
our
I
office.
know. Us too. We're downtown and we're doing everything virtually, and our clientele is better. So
Absolutely. Everybody loves it. So it's like, let's
yeah.
keep this, guys. Like, there's really not a significant liability exposure here.
Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
work with it.
That's awesome. Is there any advice or tips strategies you might want to give someone who may be thinking about getting into a career as a lawyer? Is there any kind of path you would?
It depends on the kind of law they want to do, right? I can
Yeah.
only speak to the areas that I've done.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certain areas like, say, criminal law, whether you're working for the Crown, which is the prosecutor, or the defense, that are just completely different. They are their
Different.
own
Yeah.
entities. So I really
Mm-hmm.
can't speak to them. But overall, I would say, I mean, as everyone I would assume either suspects or knows, I mean, law schools have very high academic standards to get in.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously make your application as strong as possible. If you need to take, fresh courses to upgrade your marks, do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that you can make your application as strong as it can be. The LSAT is still, I understand, a requirement. So one thing I found useful, because the LSAT had not come, let's say my LSAT writing skills were not a natural gifting of mine. We'll put it that
Okay.
way. Don't be afraid to take a course. They have many private entities offer courses.
Mm-hmm.
Take it if you need it. If you're not one of those who's able to just pick up some books at, say, I mean, back in the day, I guess chapters, now I guess only Indigo, and or order them online, because you can do all of that now,
Mm-hmm.
and go through it yourself and self-study, then seek help. That's why these entities exist. At the time, I'm sure the cost is more right now, but back when I was applying in 2007, I had taken a course through a company called Kaplan. It had cost about $1,400 then, which was a lot of money for my newly graduated from undergraduate self. So at the time, I took it off of my student line of credit. An excellent investment, because I realized that I was not naturally good at the skills that the LSAT was testing for.
Mm.
And so I needed to ensure that I had the strongest application possible. So don't be afraid to seek out help if you need to strengthen your application. Once you're in law school, that can be an interesting experience. I would say just don't lose sight of why you applied. Don't
Mm-hmm.
lose sight of why you wanted to get into this area. And even before you get into law school, don't do it just because you want to impress people. Don't do it just because you think you'll make your parents proud, or it's the natural next step,
Mm-hmm.
because you did political science in your undergrad or criminology. It's a grueling career. And you want to make sure that you actually enjoy it. Because like I mentioned earlier, there's so many fundamentally unhappy, clinically depressed, or addiction suffering lawyers. Don't make yourself one of them. Make sure that you actually want to do this. And if you don't, then have the courage to go on a different path, because it's very expensive, as I mentioned. I mean, if current tuition is now around $30,000 a year, it's just tuition. There's HST on tuition, by the way. So, and then you still have books and room and board if you're not able to live at home. So, I mean, back in the day, we were graduating with, $60,000, $70,000 in student loans. Now, folks are graduating with 90, 100, 120,000 in student loans. So, think about it.
Yeah.
Really think about it, and don't be afraid to walk away if that's not really what you want to do. And that being said, if you do decide that it's worthwhile and you're going to do it, and especially if you're on the student loan end, then try not to get disillusioned, because law school can be very disillusioning. The old adage that we found to be true when we were there, I would say probably still is true, which is the first year they work you to death. No, sorry. First year they scare you to death. Second year they work you to death, and third year they bore you to death. So, and that was so true. So by the time you get through your first 2 years, just stay focused. You can do this. You wouldn't have gotten to law school if you couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
And then when you're, searching for articling positions, actually doing your articling, which is that same internship I mentioned, and in your first few years of practice, just get all the skills you can. Don't be afraid to, unless you are really gung-ho, like I think a lot of folks who end up in areas like criminal law, whether defense or crown, they're really gung-ho from the beginning, like this is what they want to do. So if you're not like that and you're still open to the possibilities, then don't be afraid to be flexible. Don't be afraid to pivot. Don't be afraid to take chances that you didn't anticipate, like you heard in my story at the outset. Exactly. And take the doors that are open to you, because it is a very flexible, that's a nice thing. It's a very flexible field with, as by your count, over 60 different areas that you could get into. Yeah. And that are continuing to develop. COVID's bringing up new areas of law that didn't exist before.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
So it really is excellent. Just be flexible, be willing to pivot, be adaptable, get your experience, and know that where your career ends up. Heck, I'm only 8 years in, and I remember speaking to the more senior lawyers who were 30, 40 years in, that if they had looked back to the very start of their career and looked at where they are now, a lot of them didn't see that path unfolding in that way.
Okay.
So I would say though, that's a range of advice I would give depending on what point someone is at, and also taking a longer view as to, okay, if they're thinking of law school now, what can they expect in the years to come?
Because it's going to change too as years go on. And
exactly.
That's awesome. Okay, thank you, Shayna. That was great information. Thank you so much for being part of our series.
You're welcome.
Our guests for joining us, and look on our social media. We'll have Shayna's interview here, and look for our next guests. We'll have another one next week.
Wonderful. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you, Shayna. Take care.
You're welcome. Take care. Bye now.